There are places that shape the modern world while remaining almost completely unseen. Ivory Coast is one of them. Every day, billions of people enjoy chocolate whose journey began in this country. Yet few could point to it on a map. Fewer still know that the nation behind one of the world's most valuable crops has lived through an economic miracle. A devastating civil war, and one of Africa's most remarkable recoveries. This is a land of rainforests and savannas, of more than 60 languages and countless traditions. A place where colonial history, modern ambition, and extraordinary resilience meet. The world knows what this country produces. It's time to discover who its people are. Subscribe for more travel documentaries from the most remote corners of the planet, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Ivory Coast covers 322,463 square kilometers in the southern bulge of West Africa. Bordered by Ghana to the east, Burkina Faso and Mali to the north, Guinea and Liberia to the west, and the Gulf of Guinea to the south. It is roughly the size of New Mexico or Italy or Poland, substantial but not vast, and defined less by its dimensions than by the extraordinary ecological violence packed within them. The south is coastal, and the Atlantic here does not behave the way it behaves in tourist brochures. The surf lines along the Ivorian coast are long, powerful, and in many places genuinely lethal. The undertow is among the most treacherous in West Africa. The ocean does not invite. It does not sit pleasantly in the background of beach photographs. It arrives with force, pulls with purpose, and has claimed lives with a regularity that coastal communities have built their entire relationship with the sea around. Fishing on these waters is not recreation. It is a negotiation with something that could kill you, conducted daily by people who have no other choice. Moving inland from the coast, the landscape transitions through lagoon systems and mangrove channels into what was, for most of recorded history, one of the great tropical forests of West Africa. The operative word is was. The forest that once covered the entire southern half of the country, dense, layered, biologically extraordinary, home to forest elephants and chimpanzees, and hundreds of plant species found nowhere else, now covers less than a quarter of its original area. The transformation happened fast, within a single human lifetime, driven by two forces: cocoa farming and logging. The cocoa boom of the 20th century consumed the forest with an appetite that no conservation policy could adequately resist. Because for the farmers clearing the trees, the alternative to deforestation was not environmental virtue, it was poverty. The forest fell because people needed to eat, and because a global commodity system rewarded the destruction without paying for it. What remains is still remarkable. The Tai National Park in the southwest, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, contains one of the last significant fragments of the Upper Guinean forest, a biological treasure of global importance that exists in a state of constant pressure from surrounding agricultural land. The chimpanzee populations inside Tai have been studied by primatologists for decades and are among the most scientifically documented in the world. They use tools. They have distinct cultural practices that vary between communities. They are, in certain technical senses, more closely observed and better understood than the farming communities that surround them. which is its own kind of comment on whose lives the international scientific community considers worth documenting. The northern half of the country is an entirely different world. The forest gives way to savanna, the Sudanian zone. Rolling grassland under enormous sky, cut through by rivers that swell in the wet season and shrink to threads in the dry. The harmattan arrives between November and March from the Sahara, a dry, dusty wind that drops temperatures at night, coats every surface in fine particulate matter, turns the sky a pale, milky yellow, and gets into food, lungs, eyes, and the pages of books left open on a table. The harmattan is not a meteorological event, it is a season, a presence, a fact of life that structures everything from agriculture to health to the texture of daily experience. Between the forest south and the savanna north lies a transitional zone. Geographically ambiguous, culturally hybrid, agriculturally productive, that contains some of the most fertile land in the country and also some of the most contested. This is the zone where the movements of people, the clearing of forests, and the politics of land ownership have created conflicts that are quiet, chronic, and rarely covered in international media. The climate throughout is merciless in its own way. The South operates on 2 wet seasons and 2 dry seasons in a pattern that agricultural communities have organized their lives around for centuries. The rains, when they come, do not arrive gently. They arrive as walls of water, sudden and total, flooding streets that were not designed for them, overwhelming drainage systems that were inadequate when they were built and have not improved since, turning the red laterite soil into a surface of extraordinary slipperiness that swallows motorcycle wheels and undermines building foundations with equal indifference. The heat is constant in the south, humid, adhesive, the kind of heat that makes the air feel solid and that produces in long-term residents a relationship with shade that borders on the spiritual. In the north, the heat is different, dry, direct, unmediated by moisture, a heat that bakes rather than steams. Both versions are serious, neither produces passivity. What the land produces, in both its versions, is people who negotiate difficulty as a fundamental practice, who understand that the environment requires constant adaptation, who have built civilizations across these extreme and competing geographies that the world has consistently underestimated, not because those civilizations are small, but because the world has not looked. Ivory Coast has 2 cities that matter in completely different ways, for completely different reasons, and which together tell the whole story of what the country is and what it was trying to become. The first is Yamoussoukro, the official capital, the city that almost no one visits. Yamoussoukro sits in the geographic center of the country, connected to Abidjan by a 4-lane highway that runs straight through the forest and arrives, without warning, at one of the most disorienting urban environments on the African continent. The city has broad, immaculate avenues, wider than the Champs-Élysées, lined with streetlights that function, divided by manicured medians, that are almost entirely empty, not quiet, empty. The infrastructure of a major metropolis built around a population that never arrived, because the decision to make Yamoussoukro the capital was made by one man, for one man's reasons. And the city has spent the decades since trying to justify an ambition that was always more personal than civic. Yamoussoukro was his birthplace, his village, the place where his family's power was rooted. Transforming it into a capital city was not urban planning. It was biography, rendered in concrete and tarmac. But nothing Houphouët-Boigny built in Yamoussoukro prepares you for what he built at its center. The Basilica of Our Lady of Peace is, by the measurement that matters, the area enclosed under its dome, the largest church in the world. Larger than St. Peter's in Rome, larger than any cathedral in Europe, it sits in the middle of an Ivorian city of fewer than 300,000 people. Rising from the savannah with an architectural self-confidence that can only be described as audacious or delusional, or both simultaneously, depending on your perspective and your mood. The basilica was built between 1985 and 1989 at a cost that the Ivorian government has never officially disclosed. That independent estimates have placed between $300 and $600 million, and that was, by any measure, a sum that a developing country with significant rural poverty had no business spending on a single building. Houphouët-Boigny reportedly funded a substantial portion himself from personal wealth accumulated over 3 decades of power. Pope John Paul II consecrated it in 1990 in an act that generated considerable controversy within the Vatican, not least because the deal included a hospital to be built nearby for the local population. A hospital that took considerably longer to materialize than the basilica did. Around the basilica's grounds, in a man-made lake, live crocodiles. This is not metaphor, they are real crocodiles, maintained as a kind of living tradition. Houphouët-Boigny's family totem was the crocodile, and the animals were placed there with the same deliberateness with which the building was placed in the savannah, as a statement of who this place belongs to and what it represents. Yamoussoukro is strange and grandiose and slightly melancholy in the way of things built to an impossible scale, in the wrong place, for the wrong reasons. Its empty avenues, and its enormous basilica, and its crocodile lake constitute one of the most genuinely surreal urban environments in Africa, and almost no international traveler ever sees them. The second city is Abidjan, and Abidjan is the opposite of everything Yamoussoukro is. It is not empty. It is not planned. It is not grandiose in the architectural sense. It is alive, chaotic, teeming, and impossible to fully describe because it is different in every direction you look at the same moment. Abidjan is West Africa's business capital, a city of approximately 6 million people. The census numbers lag behind the reality because Abidjan has always grown faster than anyone could count. Built across a lagoon, spread over islands and peninsulas, connected by bridges that achieve gridlock with a completeness that could impress a traffic engineer from any megacity in the world. It is simultaneously a city of glass bank towers and streets that flood knee-deep in moderate rain. Of French-style brasseries where businessmen drink Bordeaux and discuss commodity prices, and of outdoor markets where the same commodity, a pile of tomatoes, a stack of plantains, is sold by 5 competing vendors at volumes that function as a kind of commerce as performance. The communes of Abidjan are not neighborhoods in the European sense. They are distinct worlds that happen to share an administrative boundary. Plateau is the financial and governmental center. Skyscrapers, ministries, banks, the National Museum, the kind of formal urban landscape that Abidjan wears slightly uncomfortably, like a suit that was tailored for someone else. Cocody is residential and aspirational. Embassies, the university, restaurants with terraces that overlook the lagoon at night, and produce, briefly and convincingly, the impression that Abidjan could be a city the world discusses the way it discusses Nairobi or Dakar or Lagos. Treichville is markets and music and streets where activity does not stop at midnight but merely changes character. And Yopougon, simply called Yopougon by everyone who lives there, is the popular commune, the vast, dense, working-class city within a city that houses more people than most Ivorian cities do independently, and that has produced more of the country's cultural output than any other single place. Yopougon is where Nuchi was invented, the Abidjan street vernacular, a fluid, inventive, perpetually evolving mix of French, Dioula, and words that exist nowhere else, that functions as the linguistic identity of Abidjan's youth, and that has spread across Francophone West Africa as the sound of urban cool. It is where the Maquis are most densely concentrated and most fiercely good. It is where the music that eventually reached Paris and then the rest of the world began as something played in courtyards for neighbors. Abidjan is a city that makes you feel, simultaneously, that everything is possible and that the system is comprehensively stacked against you. This is not a contradiction, it is an accurate description. Ivory Coast has a population of approximately 32 million. And the question of who those people are has been, for the past 3 decades, the most politically dangerous question in the country. More than 60 distinct ethnic groups live within the country's borders. The Akan peoples, including the Baule, the largest single group, and the Agni, occupy the center and east. The Kru peoples, including the Bete, inhabit the west. The Mande-speaking peoples, the Dioula, the Malinke, the Bambara, dominate the north, and, through trade networks that predate the colonial borders by centuries, are present throughout the country in market communities that function as economic connective tissue. The Senufo of the northwest, the Lobi of the northeast, the Dan of the west, the Lagoon peoples of the coastal south, each with distinct languages, social structures, ritual practices, and historical identities that the colonial border drawing process made no attempt to accommodate. And then there are the millions who came from elsewhere. Côte d'Ivoire has, for most of its post-independence history, maintained one of the highest proportions of immigrant population in Africa. Workers from Burkina Faso, the Burkinabe, came in enormous numbers during the cocoa boom, recruited actively or simply drawn by the availability of land and labor opportunity, and built entire communities in the farming zones of the West and Center. Malians, Guineans, Ghanaians, Nigerians, Lebanese merchants who have operated trading networks for generations, French expatriates who stayed after independence for reasons of business or attachment. Abidjan, in its boom decades, was a city that attracted the ambitious and the desperate from across the region and beyond. For decades, this diversity was managed through what became known, proudly, officially, as the Ivorian model. The philosophy was practical and generous simultaneously. Anyone who comes to work the land, who contributes to the national project, who builds their life here, belongs here. The cocoa boom needed bodies. The bodies came, the country grew, the model worked, for a while, well enough that other African nations observed it with something resembling admiration. But the model contained a vulnerability that its architects either did not see or chose not to address. It had no answer for the question of what happens when the boom ends, when resources become scarce, when political competition intensifies, and when the definition of who truly belongs becomes a tool that ambitious people can wield. That tool was wielded In the 1990s, as Houphouët-Boigny died and the political succession became contested, a concept emerged from the competition: Ivoirité, Ivorianness. The idea that authentic Ivorian identity could be defined, measured, and used as a qualification or a disqualification. That someone whose parents were Burkinabe immigrants was not truly Ivorian. That someone from the north with a Mande name and a Muslim faith was less legitimately part of the national story than someone from the center with Baoulé ancestry. The concept was politically constructed and politically deployed. It was used to disqualify opposition candidates from elections. It was used to challenge voting rights. It was used to define belonging in ways that excluded, at various points, millions of people who had lived in the country their entire lives. The damage was not rhetorical, it was physical. It was the fracture line along which a country that had called itself a model of coexistence discovered that the model had been sitting on a fault. The fracture and the healing. In September 2002, soldiers mutinied in Abidjan. Government forces suppressed them in the south. In the north, similar uprisings succeeded. Within days, a rebel movement called the Forces Nouvelles, the New Forces, controlled the upper half of the country. A French peacekeeping force deployed along a ceasefire line that bisected Ivory Coast at roughly the 9th parallel, and what had been a unified national territory became, functionally, two countries sharing a name. For 5 years, Ivory Coast existed in this divided condition. The North and South developed separate administrative systems, separate informal economies, separate relationships with what remained of the state. The cocoa farms in the West, which is to say, the economic engine of the entire country, became zones of predation where militias and armed groups extracted money and labor from farming communities in ways that combined the worst aspects of taxation with the worst aspects of violence. The human cost was immense and is still not fully accounted for. The displacement of communities, the destruction of livelihoods, the specific trauma of a country watching itself come apart along lines that politicians had drawn. Lines that, for millions of ordinary people on both sides, felt entirely artificial. Because they had spent their lives treating the person on the other side of the line as a neighbor, a market partner, a relative by marriage. Peace agreements came and went. The 2007 Ouagadougou political agreement created a framework that held better than its predecessors. Elections in 2010 produced a disputed result. The incumbent president, Laurent Gbagbo, refused to accept that he had lost to Alassane Ouattara. A second, shorter conflict followed. French military intervention and force from Ouattara's supporters ended it. Gbagbo was eventually transferred to the International Criminal Court at The Hague, where he was tried, acquitted, and returned in 2021 to a reception that demonstrated, unambiguously, that the political passions of the crisis had not dissolved, merely compressed. The healing that followed was partial, deliberate, and imperfect in all the ways that healing from civil conflict tends to be. Infrastructure was rebuilt, institutions were reconstructed. The economy, which had collapsed during the crisis years, began growing again at rates that once again attracted international attention. Abidjan's skyline changed, roads were built, electricity reached communities that had gone without it during the conflict years. What did not fully heal was the interior landscape. The trust between communities that had been on opposite sides, the confidence that Ivoirité and the violence it enabled could not happen again, the certainty that belonging in Ivory Coast was secure regardless of your name or your parents' origin or your religion. These are slower processes. They do not show up in GDP figures or infrastructure reports. They happen in families, in markets, in the conversations that neighbors have or do not have, in the decisions that young people make about whether their future is here or somewhere else. Ivory Coast, in 2026, is a country that has come a long way from 2002 and 2011. It is also a country that has not forgotten what happened, cannot afford to forget, and is still, every day, at the level of ordinary life, working out what it means to be Ivorian together. Ivory Coast produces between 40 and 45% of the world's cocoa in any given year. The global chocolate industry generates approximately $130 billion annually. The farmers who grow the cocoa that makes that industry possible earn, on average, somewhere between 75 cents and $1.50 per day. Read that again, slowly. Let the arithmetic sit. This is not an accident. It is not the result of individual bad actors or specific corporate malfeasance. Though individual bad actors and corporate malfeasance are certainly present, it is the result of a structural system, built during the colonial period, maintained through commodity pricing mechanisms, trade agreements, and processing monopolies, that was designed from the beginning to extract value from producing countries and capture it elsewhere. It travels to the Netherlands, to the United States, to Germany, to Belgium. The countries that appear in chocolate marketing as the source of quality and craft. There it is roasted, ground, conched, tempered, flavored, packaged, and branded. The physical transformation of a raw agricultural product into something worth $130 billion happens entirely outside the country that grew the primary ingredient. The financial value of that transformation stays entirely outside the country that grew the primary ingredient. What Ivory Coast captures is the commodity price. What the commodity price does not include is the roasting, the grinding, the branding, the retail margin, the marketing budget, the prestige of the Swiss or Belgian or French label, or the intellectual property embedded in a recipe or a flavor profile. All of that accrues elsewhere. The farmers who make this possible are among the most economically vulnerable people in the country. The cocoa farming communities of the western and central zones are characterized by inadequate infrastructure, poor access to education and healthcare, volatile income that swings with global commodity prices in ways entirely outside the farmer's control, and a dependency on a single crop that makes them structurally fragile in ways that no amount of individual effort or ingenuity can fully address. That older children are the only available workforce for tasks that require many hands during harvest periods, and that the economic alternative, removing the children from work, is not, within the household's actual budget, a real alternative at all. Major chocolate companies, Nestlé, Mars, Mondelez, Ferrero, Hershey, have made commitments to eliminate child labor from their supply chains repeatedly over the course of decades, with deadlines that pass and are quietly replaced by new deadlines that will also pass. The structural incentive to actually eliminate child labor, which would require paying prices for cocoa that allow farming families to survive without child labor, conflicts with the structural incentive to maintain the commodity price that keeps chocolate profitable at the retail margins that consumers expect. This is not a mystery. The mechanism is entirely visible to anyone who looks. Most people who consume chocolate products every day have simply never looked, because the story on the wrapper does not point in that direction. The Ivorian government has been attempting, with limited success, to change the terms of the relationship. The CGFCC, the coffee and cocoa regulator, implements a guaranteed minimum farm gate price, a system that provides some protection against the worst commodity price crashes, but does not address the fundamental terms of value distribution in the supply chain. Efforts to increase domestic cocoa processing, to grind and transform more of the bean inside Ivory Coast, capturing more of the value chain, have produced some results, but face enormous structural headwinds from the multinational companies that control the processing infrastructure and have little incentive to relocate it. The conversation that needs to happen about what a fair price for cocoa actually looks like, about what the $130 billion chocolate industry owes to the country that makes it possible, is not happening in the places where it would need to happen to produce change. It is not happening in the boardrooms of the major chocolate companies. It is not happening in the trade negotiations where these terms are set. It is not happening in the cafes where the product is consumed. It is happening in the farming communities that have been having it without an audience for decades. The languages. The official language of Ivory Coast is French, inherited from the colonial period, maintained because the country's ethnic and linguistic diversity made any single indigenous language a political impossibility as a national tongue. French functions as the language of government, education, formal business, and official life. It is a real presence in the country in ways that colonial languages are not always real presences. It is genuinely used, genuinely spoken, genuinely internalized. But it is not the language most people speak at home, in markets, with neighbors, in arguments, in love. There are approximately 65 distinct languages, belonging to three major language families: Niger-Congo, Nilo-Saharan, and within Niger-Congo, multiple subfamilies that diverge from each other more significantly than the Romance languages of Europe diverge from one another. A speaker of Dioula cannot understand a speaker of Bete without a common third language. A speaker of Senufo cannot make themselves understood to a speaker of Agni without switching into something else. The linguistic diversity of the country is extraordinary, the product of thousands of years of separate historical trajectories within a territory that no one drew lines around until the Europeans arrived. What emerged from this diversity, in Abidjan specifically, over the course of several urban generations, is Nuchi. It is not a language in the formal sense. It is a way of speaking that functions as a language. A fluid, fast-moving vernacular built on a French skeleton, but furnished throughout with Dioula vocabulary, phonological patterns from multiple Ivorian languages, and an inventive, constantly renewing creativity that generates new terms, new expressions, and new ways of saying old things faster than any lexicographer can document them. Nuchi is Abidjan's gift to itself. It is the language that crosses the ethnic divides that French official culture papers over and that traditional languages enforce. It belongs to no single group, carries no single group's prestige, and is accessible to any young person who spends enough time in the city and pays enough attention to what is being said around them. It is democratic in a way that French, with its colonial history, is not. Outside Abidjan, Dioula functions as West Africa's great trading language. Spoken across borders, up into Mali and Burkina Faso, by people who have no other common tongue but who need to sell things to each other. It is the language of commerce and of the market, practical and unpretentious and enormously widespread. In northern Ivory Coast, Dioula is the day-to-day language of communication across ethnic lines in the way that Nushi is in Abidjan. A solution invented from necessity that turned out to be more durable and more democratic than anything that was officially designed. A country that has been carrying its own story for centuries before the Europeans came to name its coast, before the colonial borders were drawn, before the first cocoa pod was traded for a price set somewhere else. It is still carrying it. It is still here. The world, as usual, has not quite been paying attention. But the country does not require the world's attention to exist. It exists regardless, loud and grieving and cooking and arguing and building and mourning and celebrating and making music in the evening air. It has always existed regardless. That is what the world keeps missing.